In this video, we're going to be looking at 5 different things you can check to see why your code isn't working. I have here a 7.1 site that we're going to be styling just a little bit to see which issues come up and how we can fix them. So let's go ahead and get started with the quote block that I have over here. So the first thing that I want to do is change the background color of the quote because right now it's not really that prominent. So let's go ahead and inspect it real quick to see which class I can use to target that quote block. So looking through my code here and going to that main wrapper, I can see that I have a couple of classes. So SQS block, quote block, and SQS code block, plus another one that says null. We're going to ignore that one. So I'm going to be grabbing quote block and adding a background color to it. So let's do that here. Quote block, and then let's add in our background color. And we're going to set this to like light gray or something. All right, so right now you can see how nothing is happening. Now, you may already know what is the problem here, but just in case you haven't noticed yet, let's go ahead and take a look through the inspect element tool to see what is happening. So opening this up again and then going back to that same container that I'm already targeting, we can see here on the right side that our snippet is present, but then everything is crossed off and we have a little warning triangle over there. So if we stand over that little warning sign or warning symbol, we can see how it says unknown property name. So in this case, I have a typo on my property, so that's why the color is not applying. So I'm not using the American spelling to type in the property, I'm using the Canadian one, so that is a problem. I need to get rid of this U that I have here. And just like that, the color is applying. So there you go. That's the first thing you can check for if you have any issues with the actual property name that you're using to be able to apply any particular style to your element. All right, so the next thing that I want to do is I want to center the text inside this quote block. So I'm going to keep this same quote block selector that I have here, and I'm going to be using the same snippet to apply my text align to be able to center the text. So I'm going to go ahead and type in here, text align middle. And just like that, you can see how nothing is really happening. So let's take another look at the inspect element tool to see what is wrong. So if I go in here and look at my quote block, I can see on the right hand side where I have my background color light gray applied, so it's not crossed off, but now I have my text align middle crossed off. So if I take a look at the little warning symbol again, you can see how it says invalid property value. In this case, I'm using the wrong keyword for the text align, so middle is not really a valid value that you can use for this particular property, so that's why it's not applying, because it doesn't really mean anything to the browser. So I'm going to change that for center. And like that, now we have our text centered. So the second thing you can check for is if you have any sort of invalid value used in your property. All right, so let's move on to another part of this website. So down here, I have a summary block carousel, and I want to be able to style the text that we have here. So this excerpt text is a little bit too small for me, so I want to make it bigger. So let's take a look through our inspect element tool and see how we're going to be targeting that container to be able to modify the font size. So looking through this summary item that I have here summary content, and then looking through all of these different elements, I can see here that I have my summary excerpt elements. So, okay, I'm going to be targeting this and adding a font size. So let's do that. I'm going to be using that class of summary excerpt. And I'm going to set a font size of about like 20 pixels. All right, so as soon as I do that, nothing is really happening. Let's go ahead and try important real quick to see if that works. Nope, nothing. All right, so I'm going to remove the important here. And we're going to take a look once again through inspect element tool because that one has all the answers. So we're going to see what is happening with our font size here. So whenever you're doing this sort of troubleshooting, remember to always stand on the element that you're targeting inside your CSS so that you can see the snippet that you're creating on the right side and you can evaluate what issue is happening. So if I stand here over my summary excerpt element and we'll take a look at the right side to look for that snippet that we typed in our custom CSS window, we can find that snippet over here. Now, I don't know if you can notice, but the font size is not really crossed off. So the code is actually applying to that element. It's just that the font is not changing size. When you encounter this type of situation, what you can do is look through the different elements that are sitting inside the thing that you're targeting currently with your CSS to see if there's something else that's closer to the thing that you're trying to style that already carries a value that is taking precedence over the one that you have right now. So let me show you what I mean by that. If we take a look here at a summary excerpt element, you can see how this one has a little arrow on the side, which means that there's more stuff inside it. So if we open this up, we can see that we have a P element in here. And then if we open this up, we can see the actual text that is sitting inside our website. So if we take a look at that P element that is directly holding the text that we're trying to style, and we take a look at the right side to check out its styles, we can see how here we have a font size of 14 pixels applied. So the thing is that this font size, because it's being applied to an element that is sort of closer to the thing that we're trying to style, the actual text that we have here, is taking precedence over the font size that we're trying to apply to the container that is before that P element. So in these cases, what we can do is to try to target the thing that already carries the value that we're trying to override. However, sometimes it's not that simple. So let me show you what happens if I add the P element to our summary excerpt selector to try to target the same thing that Squarespace is targeting right now. So if we add that P element here, we can see how nothing is happening. That's because in this particular case, there's something else going on. So if we take a look at the selector that Squarespace is using to be able to apply that font size, we can see that's a little bit more complicated than the one we have right now. However, if we break it down, it actually makes sense. So if you find any selector inside your inspect element tool that has a little bit of commas inside it, that means that selectors are being grouped together. So you have a bunch of elements that are being targeted at the same time to be able to apply the exact same styles to them. So in this case, Squarespace is targeting here the P element that is located inside the summary excerpt that is located inside the SQS block summary v2 element. Now, in this case, this class of SQS block summary v2 is located all the way up inside the main wrapper of the entire carousel. The next selector that we see here is Squarespace targeting the UL element. So these are the bullet points inside the summary excerpt element inside the SQS block summary v2 element. So in this case right now, we don't have any bullet points applied, but if we had any, then we already know that these same styles are going to apply to that. And then the last selector that we have here is targeting the LI elements. So these ones are the list item elements, either inside a bullet point list or an ordered list. So the one that has the numbers inside the summary excerpt, inside the SQS block summary v2. Again, we don't have any sort of list items right now inside the summary excerpt, but the code is still there. So if we happen to add any of those elements in there, we already know that this code is going to apply to them. Now, right now, we're going to forget those other two selectors because, like I said, we don't have the elements. We're just going to focus on this first one that we have here. So the problem is that the one that we're using has sort of less details. It's less specific than the one that Squarespace is already using to apply the original font size. So one quick fix to be able to make sure that our new value overrides the old value is to reuse the same selector that Squarespace already has in place to apply the font size of 14 pixels to be able to change it to 20 pixels. So let's see what happens if I grab this part of the code. Again, I'm going to ignore the other two for the moment because we're not really using those elements right now. So I'm going to grab that little part up here, and then I'm going to substitute that selector in here. So once I do that, you can see how the font size now changes because we're using the same specificity, so the same amount of detail basically to tell our browser where that font is located to be able to change the size. So now if we take a look at Inspect Element tool, we're going to see how our little snippet is over here, and now the font size of 14 pixels is getting crossed off because our snippet is taking over that particular property for the P element. Now, if we wanted to make sure that things stay consistent and the same type of elements get styled the same way with the same font size in case we decide to add them in the future, what we can do is actually copy the entire group of selectors that we have here and use that in our code. So let's grab that and paste it in here. And then we're going to have the exact same result as before, because again, we're still targeting that P element that is already carrying that font size of 14 pixels, the same way that Squarespace is targeting it in the first place. Now here's the thing. Sometimes this approach may not be the best way to go. Sometimes the way that Squarespace is targeting something is not exactly the same way that we want to do it. Perhaps they're being a little bit too specific, especially if you're working with 7.1 and the selector includes something about the color theme that is being applied to a particular section. Maybe you kind of want to skip that part, and so it becomes a little bit more complicated to reuse the exact same thing that Squarespace was using in the first place. In those cases, when you don't really have another option, or you don't want to look for another option, let's be honest here, what you can do is go back to targeting that same element that already carries the value, but the way that you were doing it in the beginning. So in this case, that would be summary excerpt P. So the way that we were doing it before, making sure that we're targeting the exact same element that already carries that original value, and then using the important rule. Now, I really recommend trying to leave the important rule as a last resort, because later on it can pretty much become a nightmare. So save yourself the headache as much as possible and try to find another way to target the same thing, whether by reusing that same selector or by creating your own more specific selector before trying to apply the important rule. Now, that being said, it's pretty handy, so I'm going to show you how you can use it. Basically, all you have to do, if you haven't done it before, is to simply add here an exclamation point and then add the word important. So once you do that, what's going to happen is that you're basically going to scream to your browser that this is the value you want to apply, regardless of whatever was added inside that same element. The key here is that you need to be targeting, once again, the same element that already has that value. Otherwise, it's not going to work. We already saw it when I tried to add the important rule to the summary excerpt. It didn't work. It needs to be added to the same element that already carries the style if it wasn't inherited, but that's a different topic, to be able to use the important rule effectively. Now, speaking of important, I want to show you something else that you might want to check. So let's go ahead and move on to the top section that I have here. And I want to try to edit the space that I have here at the top. So if I take a look through the inspect element tool, if I send here over the entire section, this first section of my page, you can see how I have a very chunky padding at the top. Now I want to make this slightly larger, so I'm going to go ahead and edit it. I already know that I am on the right container to target that padding because I'm literally seeing it there. And then if I take a look on the right side, I can see that up here it says padding top, and then it gives me the value for the current padding at the top that's being applied to that section. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to target my section through the data section ID, and then I'm going to apply a different padding at the top. So let's go ahead and do that. All right, padding at the top, and then let's make this 300 pixels. Of course, nothing happened because otherwise this tutorial wouldn't make any sense. So let's take a look at what's happening here. If we go back to our section and then we look at the padding at the top here, we can see how the padding is being displayed at the very top of all of the styles that we have for this particular section. What this means is that this padding is being applied as an inline style to the element that we're looking at. An inline style is basically a style that's being added to the HTML code of the element itself. So if we take a look inside the code here that we have for that particular section, down here we can see where it says style, and then we have padding top, and we have the value that we can see up here. So the problem with these inline styles is that there's no other way to override them except by using important. That's the only way that you're going to be able to tell your browser to ignore the style that's literally stuck to the element and use the one that you're telling it to use. So if we go back to our code and we add here the important rule, you're going to see how now I have a larger padding because it's replacing the one that was inside the inline style up here. Now, before we wrap up, I want to give you a bonus tip to show you something else that you can check in case your code isn't working. So let's say that you're trying to get more specific with the things that you want to target inside your entire site. And for example, you want to target all page sections on the site that have a small height applied to them. So you already know that you can use the page section class here and then the section height small class here, because that one is applied to all of the page sections that have that height set to small through the section settings. And if you didn't know that, now you do. So let's go ahead and use these two classes inside our selector instead of the data section ID that we're using right now to modify that padding at the top. So I'm going to change this to page section. And then the other class was section height dash dash small. All right, so section height dash dash small. So right now you can see how nothing is happening. It should still work because we tried it with the data section ID. So the padding at the top 300 pixels important is working. So that's the correct declaration that we can use there to modify that padding. But for some reason, the code isn't working. So let's take a look and see what's happening. So standing on the same element that we're targeting, if we're looking on the right side to find our snippet, we can see how it's not there. So our code, the one that we have right now inside the custom CSS window, is not showing up on the right side of our inspect element tool. So when this is happening, when you're standing on the element and you're 100% sure that you're standing on the element that you're supposed to be targeting in the custom CSS window and you don't see the code on the right side, the first thing you can do is actually refresh the page, because sometimes Squarespace gets a little bit glitchy with that. And then the second time around when you check it, if you don't see anything on the right side, the problem is with the selector that you're using. So in this case, the problem is that those two classes belong to the exact same element. So I shouldn't have any sort of space between those classes, because otherwise I'm telling my browser to look for the section height small element that is sitting inside the page section element. But in this case, that's not true. Both things are the same element. So if I remove the space in here, you're going to see how the code applies. And now if we take a look at the right side, we're going to find our snippet in here. Now, of course, this was the solution for this particular case because I was using two classes from the same element. But if you have a more complex selector that involves targeting a lot of different containers, you may have to go back through it again and compare it with the structure that you have inside the HTML to make sure that everything that you're targeting is in the right order, and then any classes that belong to the same element don't have any space together. Now, this is a topic for a different tutorial, but for now, I want to leave you with this. If you can't find the code that you're using in your custom CSS window within the styles that you have for the element that you're targeting, then the issue is in your selector. Alrighty, so that's all that I have for you today. I really hope that these tips help you troubleshoot your code in your next Squarespace project.